Thank you. It's an honor to be here to speak to IANS, and I want to thank Debbie and IANS, the committee, for allowing me to share this. This is a new talk. Just recently, I came through the Southwest in California and shared a lot about my near-death experience and because of our new book that came out, Voyage of Purpose. But because of the theme this year, 2012 and beyond, it was kind of interesting. When we did this book tour, everybody, every community we went to wanted to know about what I saw in the future, because I allude to it in the book, but I really didn't share that. So this is the first time that I'm going to share in public what the visions that I've had for not only just my future, but the future for our world. And also, this is, I normally just talk. I normally don't use PowerPoint, but this time, you know, I thought, well, my little engineer brain thought, this would be a good idea, let's do a PowerPoint. And I got all excited. I was going to do this jazzy PowerPoint thing and everything. And then Spirit says, no, keep it simple and efficient. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go with that. So I do have to tell you right off the bat, I do hear voices. They tell me what to do, and I like it. I like it. Also, I'm going to ask, it's kind of like what Danny did the other day, I'm going to ask us to breathe every once in a while, because I know there's a lot of folks in here that are empathic, and I'm operating on one lung, so I get out of breath very easily when I'm talking. It's just a common way that I talk, so I'm going to ask us to breathe, because it's really about my self-preservation. Now, today I'd like to share a little bit about my near-death experiences, but not like in my normal talk, because I really want to focus on what I had seen in the future. So I'm really going to try to focus just on the components in my near-death experience that took me into the future, and just a little bit about what led up. But I'm not really going to talk about the integration and how one experience built upon the other and how it transformed my life. So I really want to just focus as much as I can on how I was able to start to see future and future potentials. Because the way I saw the future is I saw that there's many potentials out there. And some of them are a little disturbing, and some of them are very empowering. So, and also, it's difficult because when in the light, time doesn't exist. And it's hard for me to take what I'm experiencing in the light and then plug it into my timeline. I'll talk a little bit about that. So, in 1983, I used to be the chief engineer of the research vessel Aloha. We did underwater exploration. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was a man in the maze. You know, I was going through life and all the twists and turns in life and trying to understand what was going on. The Man in the Maze is a story that the Pima people talk about, and it just so happens that we're sitting in their territory right here, right now. And in March of 1983, on a very dark night, I was 2 miles off the California coast, and I happened to be in a small boat, and there were 25-foot seas. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was facing my death. I was thrown from that small craft into the raging sea, and I drowned. But I entered this darkness, this absolute void. But this void was fertile and rich, and I felt comforted and supported. I just died this very violent death, and I was curious. Because not only was I the chief engineer of Aloha, but I was also a commercial diver. So I'd been trained in commercial diving. We actually go through oxygen deprivation exercises so that we understand what the signs and symptoms are. This was something way beyond that. And it felt like I wasn't alone in this darkness. I felt like there was this omnipresent intelligence at hand, and somehow I knew that I was going to move on from here. But I felt so supported while I was in this darkness. And then slowly it started turning light around me. And I saw this light off in the distance. I kept moving ever closer to this light. And as I got closer, there were waves and waves of love that were just wrapping me in this warm embrace. It was the most amazing feeling I'd ever had. And it felt as if this love was actually permeating my being, and it transformed me into this being of light. And as I got closer to the light appeared to me like it was millions upon millions of fragments of light, and they were all dancing and interacting, coalescing and separating. It was like they were of one mind. The only thing I've ever experienced here on earth that would remind me of that light is, have you ever seen on maybe Discover or an aquarium or something, these giant schools of sardines or anchovies, and how they all school together and they all move and dance to the light, all like one mind? Well, picture that in an infinite light, with just millions of fragments of light, and they were all interacting and working together. Three fragments broke away and they came toward me. And when they came toward me, I recognized them. I recognized them as my family, but not a family that I had lived with here on this earth or in this life, but a family that I had forgotten. I call them my soul family because they were a part of me and I'm a part of them. And when I talk about spirit and spirit communication, it's usually my soul family that I'm talking to. They greeted me. They were welcoming me home. It's still hard to talk about. But eventually there were a dozen that greeted me. And we went into the light. And we went to this area that felt very spherical. And in this area, we started to relive my life. Well, you've heard a lot of stories this weekend about, near-death experiences and life reviews. Mine wasn't all that much different. I felt as if I was reliving my life, but not just from my point of view. It was like my consciousness split into these multiple streams of consciousness, and I could experience it through everyone I'd ever interacted with in my entire life. I got to feel their hurt and their pain. I got to feel their joy and their love. And it was intense, would be a word. But I found that not only was I experiencing it, but my entire soul family was experiencing it with me. And they were very excited. They were just excited to be there and experiencing this life event. And as I would have these interactions, I would see these ripples of after effects that would occur, It was all so clear. So every action that I did, I saw the reactions that occurred. Now, I lived a pretty dysfunctional life prior to this. I was a pretty brash young man. My philosophy was you cut your swath through life, and that's a pretty brutal philosophy. So you can imagine there were some unsavory parts of my life that I had to go through. And I was ashamed that my soul family had to experience that. But it didn't matter to them. They just loved me, they supported me. But they also got to feel when I would do something with loving intention. And that would create some of the biggest ripples. What I thought was important, like being the chief engineer, I achieved that pretty early in life, in my mid-20s. I thought that was pretty important. But in the life review, it hardly any significance whatsoever. But when I did something with loving intention, that would create some of the biggest ripples. So I went through this life review, seeing the good and the bad, but then I started seeing things that I didn't have a reference to in this life. I started seeing my future. I didn't know it at the time. I didn't quite comprehend what was happening because in the life review, everything was crystal clear. My interactions, what other people were feeling, how it affected them, the after effects, all of that was crystal clear. But once we stepped across into the future, it became a little less clear. It was like I was viewing this core path of potentials. And if I took this path, the interactions and the ripples would get hazier as it radiated outward. So this disoriented me a little bit. This was something I really wasn't, I didn't know what was going on. But my soul family just supported me, they loved me, they buoyed me up with some more energy, and they got me through this. So I saw a lot of different potentials of my life. And I was, in this life review, it was mostly focused on my life, my potential future. And it appeared, well, I'll talk a little bit about that later. Then the light itself, this infinite light, spoke to me. And it said, I've heard this said all weekend, and I thought it was really unique. It said, "This is not your time, you must return." And I said, no way. And I argued, and I perceived this light to be God. So I argued with God. And I said, no, I've got a family here I never knew. I'm feeling loved like I've never felt I was loved. I mean, I never knew when we're walking this life that we're loved. I mean, we are loved. I never knew that. And I didn't want to go back to that separation. I didn't want to go back to that body. And that body I knew was still in the ocean, being tumbled and tossed, was very broken, and was just cold. It's not something I wanted. Cold and confining. I didn't want to go back to that. I thought I presented a pretty good case. You can see I'm here. The light spoke one more time and said, no, you must return. You have a purpose. Oh man, that word purpose just, went into my being. And when you're in that light, you're connected to this consciousness that's so much more than just yourself. You're connected. To me, it felt like you're connected to all the souls that ever were and all the souls that ever will be. And so you have this immense knowing. And I understood that purpose. And with understanding, I found myself outside my body. And I won't go into the details because I really do want to keep this on time because there's a lot I want to talk about. But there was a bit of a miraculous resuscitation, you might say, where my body was slammed up against some wreckage and it pushed the water out of my lungs. And there were three of my soul family that originally greeted me were with me. And when this water was pushed out of my lungs. They pushed me back into my body, and I took my first breath. Man, I wish I looked that good. When you come back, the light lingers. It stays with you. For me, it stayed with me for about 3 days. I felt like I was half here and half there. But this experience rocked my world. I was an engineer. I saw things in black and white. This was something just totally different. I did not know how to deal with this experience. I tried to share it with my family, and at the time, I got a very bad response. I didn't feel like I could talk to them about my experience. And the world I lived in was, we did underwater exploration. And back in the 80s, it was so dangerous, we couldn't even be insured. Lloyd's wouldn't even insure us. Our company used to have to take a bond out on each and every one of our lives because the work we did was so dangerous. So we put each other's lives in each other's hands every day that we were on the job. So death was a taboo subject. So I felt absolutely isolated and alone. I had no one to talk to about this. And I wanted my old life back. And all the time, I'm thinking, God, I was in that light, and I understood this purpose. Purpose. Now I'm here. What is this purpose? You know? So I wasn't a real happy camper. But, so what I did, what I thought, the healthiest thing I thought I could do for myself was, divers, we like duct tape, you know? So I thought I would take the light, the soul family, you know, nobody talks to God. I'm going to put all that into a box. And I'm going to duct tape that baby closed. I'm going to take out some magic markers and I'm going to write all over it, do not touch. And I'm going to put it as far back in my brain and in my memory as I possibly can, never to ever, ever be touched again. Yeah, like that was going to work, right? There were some things that I could deal with, my little engineer brain could deal with right off the bat. And I called it acceptance, tolerance, and truth. Because after having that in-depth life review, I suddenly knew who I was. And that's quite an accomplishment for a guy at 26, I thought. I knew who I was. And I could accept, yeah, I've got a lot of issues, but I can work on myself. I can be better. And then tolerance. Before this experience, like I said, I used to cut my swath through life. And tolerance was not in my vocabulary. And suddenly I saw, because of this life review and because of the love that I experienced, that, you know, we cross paths all the time with people that we may not understand, or life situations. We may be in a life situation that we're not tolerant of. But it's only temporary. And that we can change. And that we may not understand where another person is coming from, but we can be tolerant. And then the other one was truth. As an engineer, I used to see truth as hard and cold facts. It's the way I lived my life, was through logic and reason. Well, suddenly I have this new perception of truth. It was a little hard for my engineer brain to wrap around it, but I saw that we all have individual truths. And that our heart recognizes when we walk across or we come in contact with our personal truths. Well, I could deal with that. So I had this new mantra, acceptance, tolerance, and truth, you know, AT&T, reach out and touch someone, right? But the hardest one was I started getting these intuitive knowings. Like, where did that come from? It wasn't something I'd studied, wasn't something I'd experienced in life. I didn't trust it at first. So what would any engineer do? You test it, right? And over time, I began to rely on this new knowing that I was getting. And I mean, I really began to rely on it. It was very helpful. I mean, there were times that I would know ahead of time when you know, one of my engines was going to have a problem, or I was going to have you know, something going on with one of the screws, or the, you know, something like that. And people would ask me, you know, geez, how did you know? How did you know these things? And I was pretty good at covering up. Oh, you know, that comes with experience. But I was changing. I didn't think I was, because I really thought that I had gotten beyond this near-death experience. I didn't even have a name for it. It was just an experience. And but I was changing, and I really didn't know it at the time. But I had this incredible urge that I needed to do more with my life. I needed to be of service with my life. And so I quit my life at sea, and this was a dream job, I'm telling you. Being able to, we did some cool stuff. I could tell you sea stories all day long. But I quit my life at sea because I felt like I needed to be more of service. And I became the manager of dialysis service in upstate New York in Syracuse at St. Joseph's Hospital. And I really felt like I was really being of service there. And I faced a lot of challenges, but I had some new tools in my arsenal, you know. And it really helped me, you know, to get through a lot of these challenges, especially with this new intuitive knowing and everything. But I didn't tell a soul about my experience for 11 years. I never mentioned it again for 11 years. And then, part of my youth, I grew up in Sedona, you know, north of here, in the Verde Valley. And I went there on this retreat with this spiritual group. And there's something about the Verde Valley for me that when I get there, I can breathe. Speaking of which, I think we should all just take a breath. I could breathe here, and I can relax when I'm in the valley. So we went, the first day, this group wanted to do a meditation, and I went up there. And I sat on the rock, went into meditation, and the light spoke to me. Very simply, it just said, return to the light. And there was no stopping it. I found myself reliving my entire near-death experience. I had stumbled across that box somehow, and I had kicked it open. But it's interesting, because this time around, I'd lived 11 more years. And in the life review, because I went from the darkness, you know, into the light, met my soul family, did the life review, only I'd lived 11 more years. And I got to see how much change was affected just by adopting those simple little things, acceptance, tolerance, and truth, and then some intuitive knowings. It had totally changed who I was. Unbeknownst to me, I didn't know. It was such a gradual change, I didn't realize how much I had changed. And it made me think, you know, that a lot of these experiences, whether it's a near-death experience or a spiritually transformative experience, they plant a seed in our being. And how much we nurture them determines how much they're going to bloom in our life. Well, in this experience, I also, because I wasn't quite, the first experience, I have to tell you, I was in awe. I was in gaga awe of the entire experience. And in this second experience, I found I was paying a little more attention. And I saw that what created the future, because I got to see this 11-year span, that when I would attach an intention to one of the potentials, one of the crossroads, that the universe would kind of align itself and create that reality in my life. That's kind of, again, it's rocking my world a little bit, but I saw how this affected change in my life. And I also saw that we're all interconnected. There's like this fabric of interconnection between all of us. And we don't even have to affect change in myself, affects change in all of us. And when I don't even have to be in your presence to affect change, I can do it just simply through my intention. Well, one more that rocked my boat. After light came to me and told me to return to the light, now I started hearing spirit. Oh boy. That one scared me for a while too. I thought for sure, okay, put the coat on, haul me away. I can't talk about this. I still hadn't shared this experience, but when I came out of the experience, I came down. I was with this spiritual group, and it just so happened in this spiritual group there were near-death experiencers. Imagine that, And one of them was Tom Sawyer. Yeah, right? A lot of people know Tom. For those of you that are new to IANS, Tom was involved with the very beginning of IANS. He used to camp out at Ken Ring's near-death hotel. That's what Tom called it. Yeah, you could check in, but you could never check out. But Tom taught me to embrace these gifts that I got from my near-death experience. He also introduced me to IANS. But I had a second mentor that influenced me even more. Her name was Margaret Keene. And I doubt, she was involved with IANS, but very low-key. Let me tell you a little story how I met Margaret. I was standing in line for this registration. It was the same spiritual group that I was on retreat with. I'm standing in line to go to a summer conference. And it's a 10-week summer conference, or 10-day summer conference. And I'm standing in line, I'm trying to figure out what classes I'm going to take when I register. And all of a sudden, this white-haired woman walks in front of me, and you could feel love. And she looked at me, she turned and looked at me, and she said, "David, welcome." Gives me this big hug, and then walks away. And poof, she's gone. I was stunned. Who is this person? I hadn't even registered yet. I didn't know who she was. I don't have a name badge on yet. I haven't even got to the desk, to sign in yet. And yet she knew me by name, and she loved me. And so I, kind of turned to the next person. I said, who was that? Said, "Oh, that's Margaret. She's one of the teachers here at the conference." Whatever it is, I'm taking it, and I go through. What is Margaret teaching? Everything you want to know about sex and death. Okay, I'm there. She was a character. I sat in that class, and Margaret, and I was going to be a wallflower. I wanted to check this out. I wanted to know what this was, because you would be in her presence, and everybody felt this. It was palpable. The love that came off this person was amazing. So I wanted to know about this. I wanted to try to understand this, because, boy, that was something I want to achieve in my life, right? So I'm sitting in the back of the class, low profile. You don't see me. And Margaret would start talking, and all of a sudden I realized, oh my God, she's a near-death experiencer. She's an experiencer. And so she'd be talking about something about the light, and all of a sudden she'd turn around and say, "Isn't that so, David?" Holy cow. I have this, they taped all this, and I have this on audio tape, and it just blows my mind every time I listen to it. But so she knew more about me. She recognized in me what I didn't even recognize in myself. And she became my mentor. And I went down to her house one time. She used to have a retreat center down in Smith Mountain Lake, Virginia. And she used to teach this method on how people could have a little mini NDE and gain some awakening spirit. So I went down there with some friends, and one night, Margaret and I are alone. We're sitting in her living room. And let me check, see if I'm on track with these slides here. So we're sitting in her living room. She starts to tell me, we're talking about our experiences, and she goes, David, she goes, I know that you went into the future in your near-death experience. And have you ever thought about just going into the light and looking into the future for humanity? I said, what, are you crazy, Margaret? I said, no way. I said, when I was dead, I could go into the light. I could experience that profound love and compassion because I didn't have a body. I didn't have my emotional centers were in that dead body. But boy, anytime I touch the light now or I share it, I just start crying. And it overwhelms my emotions. I said, there's no way I'm going into the light for any reason. And Margaret, in that calm, peaceful, loving way, said, well, would you do it with me? And so we sat there, we talked. And while we were talking, it seemed as if there was an expansion. Margaret and I are just sitting there, eye to eye, talking. And it felt like there was an expansion beyond the living room, beyond the retreat center, Smith Mountain Lake, beyond our world, beyond the galaxy, and we were at the threshold of the light. And we crossed that threshold together. Well, we started to look into the future. And looking, it was very much like in my life review, where there were a lot of potentials. And as you moved away from the potentials, it would get hazier and hazier. It wasn't as certain. And we glimpsed a lot of fragments of the future. And what I saw in these glimpses were a lot of stress on our social, economic, and political structures, to the point where they were having some stability problems. And a few years ago, when we had the housing bubble pop, the alarm bells started ringing. I saw those instabilities because a large proportion of our population suddenly started going through a lot of suffering, just very similar to what I'd seen in these fragments. And the euro, the trouble we're experiencing with Greece and Spain right now, very stressed out social economic systems. Well, Margaret taught me how to go back into the light, and I started some of my own sojourns into the light. It was kind of funny. One thing, before I move forward though, that night, Margaret and I were sitting there, and it felt like we talked through the entire night, and it felt like we went into the light, but we were having this conversation in her living room the whole time. It was a very weird situation for me. The next morning, we get up, and some of the other friends come in. We're all sharing breakfast, and William says, last night I came into the living room, and you and Margaret were there. I said, you came in the living room? You didn't come into the living room. He says, yes, I did. He said, I sat there probably for a good hour. He said, and the two of you were just staring at each other. It was like you were talking without words. Some of the stressors that could strain our political economic structures on the earth. I mean, these are some of what we're seeing. Increase in droughts, hurricanes, forest fires, tsunamis, flooding, earthquakes, and it doesn't even take into effect man-made stressors. Things like war, suppressive governments, terrorism, genocide, or just plain old greed and corruption. Those all create stressors on our social economic systems. Now, in my sojourns into the light, I've never seen a total collapse, but I have seen a lot of suffering because we have to change the way we live our lives in order to get through some of the stressors that could potentially face us. Because I saw where governments, very similar to like the housing bubble, they could not support those people that lost their homes. They lost everything. It was up to communities to supply what those people needed. Well, I see that I continue to see that we're gonna face some more of that in this change that we're on the threshold of. It's going to be hard for some, especially those that have trouble changing. Okay. Spirit just said something. It says we have to pay attention and not be rigid in our views. Because rigid views, we need to be flexible with our views. Rigid views inhibit our insight. And how are we going to move forward if we don't have some new insight? Some of the things I saw is if we can get involved in greater community interaction, that we're going to get through this. We're going to be fine. And so as I continue to sojourn in and out of the light, because Margaret showed me that night how to go back to the light. And she taught me through a few more conversations that, because I still would get very emotional whenever I'd get near the light, and she taught me that you can anesthetize your emotions by touching it lightly until you become comfortable. And so then I started having these journeys into the light. But then I started to have some concerns, some challenges, and some potential empowering outcomes that are in our future. So we do kind of face a stormy night. Reduced services is going to require that communities pick up the ball. And an interesting thing is I saw that there are other groups, and whether consciously or not, that have already started building community. And I mean, some of these groups have amassed quite a war chest, and they're far outpacing spiritual communities' efforts. And some of my concerns are they going to open their doors if things get bad? On this book tour, I was at a friend's house in California, and she took me through her community, beautiful community. I won't mention any names, but she took me up to this one place. It was this huge complex. It was all behind these walls and fences and gates, and she said, this is a religious organization here, and they have so become a part of our community and a part of our governance that the social services are pretty much run through this organization. And she says, and because I'm not a part of their congregation, I'm a second citizen. I'm on the outside looking in. I can't participate in my community with certain things. And boy, I'll tell you, my alarm bells were like spirits like going, are you paying attention? So, I mean, you know, who's in, who's out? You know, isn't that a silly way to think? It blows my mind. And so I have some concerns. I have some concerns that if we face challenges in the future, are some of these organizations going to open their doors? Many times in the past, look at 9/11, you know, everyone opened their doors. We all came together for a few weeks, a few months. And then we went on to we fell back into our old habits. Spiritual communities, and boy, I'll tell you, I talk to experiencers all around the world now, and I see the message, and I get a lot of empowering hope, and I see that there are tons of spiritual communities, but they're below the surface right now. But they're growing, but they're below the surface. And these spiritual communities, though, they do not have the ways and means to be able to support their communities at this point. But they're out there. And there's a lot of big businesses that are starting to adopt heart-centered business models. And they're growing. But at this point in time, they hold very little political or social weight. They don't influence a lot of our social systems at this point. But they're growing. These heart-centered modeled businesses are growing. So one of my greatest concerns is that fear is our biggest enemy. Fear is our biggest enemy. But we could still yet hope, you know, win the day, you might say, if we can increase spiritual values. We have to dispel this thought of, you know, all for me. We need to turn it around to all for we. So, some of the solutions and potentials that I've seen are for us to come together, work together in caring, creating communities. And I saw the long road, the end game was a world working together, very much like what Nancy was saying this morning. But this is where I had trouble with timing. In the light, I have a hard time plugging it into our timeline. Like in the light, I saw in 2000 I was going to have cancer. And I had stage 4 lung and bone cancer that metastasized into my spine and caused it to collapse, and they found I had lesions in my hip, my brain, and my kidneys. And, you know, but I thought that was going to happen in my doties. I didn't think it was going to happen in my 40s. And, but I also saw in my future vision that I was going to survive it. And I was able to overcome that severe prognosis within 6 months. And for me, that was veridity that these experiences are real. That these experiences are real. And so we need more resources. We need, and that means that we've got to start working. We've got to get to work. Because we need loving intention infused into our businesses, into our social activity, into everything. We need to create that loving heart, very much like Margaret used to live her life. We need to create that within ourselves. Start living with loving intention. And when we start to live by loving intention, we start to infuse that energy into our businesses and eventually into our own governance. And you know what I think? Experiencers know the way. Experiencers, and I'm talking about all experiencers, not just near-death experiencers, but spiritually transformative experiencers. We have the key to this future because we've gone through the trial of integration. We've already gone through this trial of integration and trying to transform ourselves into a more loving, caring, compassionate person. We hold the key to our own communities. We've gotten past the mental traps that our society has created for years. We've let go of the mental drives. The material drives. We've let go of a lot of material drives. So, and we recognize the genuine within. We recognize that right action flows naturally. Our hearts are normally and naturally benevolent. And this allows us to move ahead freely without the need to think about what's right. You know, there's an old Buddhist teaching about, a bird doesn't have to go to class to learn how to sing. We know what's appropriate. And we just need to move beyond our old methods. It's because it's so easy to fall back into those old patterns. We need to step outside our circle of comfort and expand our boundaries by developing communities of cooperation. And I think we could start that today. And we start it by working within ourselves. If you're worried about the world, then you need to start setting that intention and in visualizing a world of peace and compassion and working together in community. We need to tend to our own gardens. And that way we will inspire through our own example and start to create a quiet emergence. So let's all take a breath. That was the heavy stuff. Sorry, guys. I don't like to preach on Sunday. As we begin to see each other as people, and not as different races or creeds or governments or organizations or political parties, and when we start to live our lives by not thinking about, I have to live my life in such a certain way so that I can line my pockets, I think we're going to begin to turn this world around. Let's take another breath. Indeed, we need to work toward a shift in consciousness. It's not going to happen overnight, and it's going to require all our efforts. Each and every one of us can have the capacity to develop a more heart-centered awakening within our being. The way many experiencers are trying to live their life already. That's our greatest hope for the future. Let their trial of integration be our guide to move forward. Because, like the man in the maze, experiencers have gone through a lot of those twists and turns. And we've been to the center and we're looking outward in all directions. And I think we're a bright hope for our future. Thank you very much.
What was Margaret's last name?
Margaret
taught
Keene.
You how to return?
Margaret Keene. Margaret is passed. She's no longer with us. Well, she is. She is with us, right? Yeah, and I talk to her quite frequently. She had a lot of lessons, though. She cautioned me a lot to share what I knew, but to let everybody know that you're a fallible human being. Don't let anybody ever put you, even though you're an experiencer, don't let anybody ever put you on a pedestal. I love Margaret, and I hope that someday I get to that level where I'm walking around, 85 to 90% of my life exuding this love, this amazing love.
I want to continue our conversation a little bit that we had at lunch when we were talking about choice points.
You get closer to the mic.
Okay, I want to continue our discussion that we were having at lunch about choice points, where one's more clear than the other.
Yeah.
That reminded me of something that I read where you find yourself at a particular point, and what you get is the next point you're going to. That's where the clarity exists. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, because I saw that our future is lined with so many different potentials, and those would be those points I believe that you're trying to say. And that once we attach an intention to it, it's like, but I mean, when I say attach an intention, I'm not talking about, yeah, I really want that Camaro, it's hot, you know. I'm not talking about that type of intention. I'm talking about a heart-centered, loving type of intention that is for the good for all, that type of intention, to put you in a place where you can be of service, where you can help humanity. Those intentions will shape your future and lead you to the next point where then you're going to define your next intention.
Which takes me to my next question, and that is the 11 years difference that you have. Would you agree with this question, or with this statement? The universe has an answer, which is yes, if it is for the higher good.
Yeah, I do, and it's hard to see for us sometimes, because we're on the ground.
Agreed.
I do agree, yes.
Agreed.
I agree. Because sometimes intentions are carried forward, like the suffering that occurred with the housing bubble, all right? But what came from that? We had people that came together to help a lot of individuals. Sometimes you got to rock the boat in order to shake it up enough to really affect real change. Thanks, those are great questions.
I had a question. I really appreciated your presentation. When you first saw the light and the second time you saw the light, you talked about potential pathways that you saw. Did you see those as choices? It's part of the question.
What was the last part?
Did you see those as possible choices?
Yes.
And could you see down any of those pathways any part of a form of conclusion that going down that pathway would develop purpose and meaning?
Yeah, it's really interesting, because I did see a lot of divergent pathways. Like let me look at the cancer, because that's a great example. I was diagnosed with this cancer, and I saw that I could accept the cancer, because I never really did come around to purpose in my talk. I usually talk a lot about that when I just talk about my near-death experience, but not about the future. But in my potential future, I knew I was going to deal with cancer, and I saw down that path that I was going to overcome it. And it's kind of like that path shimmered a little brighter. The other path was I could accept the prognosis and I could go home. Man, I'll tell you, I wanted that path. But it wasn't as bright. And I knew I needed to fulfill my purpose. And I feel that by overcoming the cancer, by going through that additional suffering that I went through, I was able to. So, yes, I was able to see options and things like that.
Did you see that purpose
Well,
that you chose as a responsibility spiritually?
It's kind of interesting, because a lot of times I think we have to go through our life's trials and tribulations, be the man in the maze, in order to reveal our purpose, so that once we get to the center, that's when we're looking outward, we start to understand the purpose.
Thank you very much.
We have time for one more question.
Many thanks. Thank you for reminding me of the one lesson I learned on the other side. Do not argue with the being of light. You will not win. I speak from experience. My question is this. with 911, the night of 911, like many other experiences, I hardly slept. With the Japanese tsunami and earthquake, for a week, almost more afterwards, I felt absolutely terrible. Do you have any advice of how to deal with that if and when it happens again?
You know, that's an excellent question. I don't think I really have a good answer for it, but what I would recommend is as we work on our spiritual awakening, our spiritual emergence, I think that we'll start to recognize those potentials, because those were potentials. We were all feeling 9/11 potential, the tsunami potentials, well ahead of time. Nancy had that slide that showed how ions has those eggs out there that can actually perceive our how we perceive things that are coming in the future. And we saw that hours ahead. You were one of the people that could physically manifest an empathic response. I think as we move forward, I think that we'll be able to develop that further. Maybe, if maybe not in our generation, but maybe in the future, maybe we'll be able to, stem some of the suffering.
Many thanks indeed for your reply, sir.
Thank you.